Every day, the school bell rang at 3 p.m. sharp, signaling the end of another busy school day. The hallways buzzed with chatter as students packed their bags and hurried toward the gates to meet their parents or catch the bus home. Among them was Emily, a quiet and thoughtful 8-year-old who always waited patiently by the front gate for her father, Mark, to arrive. Mark was a tall man in his mid-30s with short brown hair and glasses that gave him an intellectual look. He worked as a mechanic but always made sure he was on time to pick up Emily. To most people at the school, Mark seemed like a devoted dad, polite, responsible, and caring. Teachers often commented on how kind he was during parent-teacher meetings, and the staff trusted him completely. Everything about their routine appeared normal, or so everyone thought. Emily's homeroom teacher, Miss Carter, had taught dozens of children over the years, but there was something about Emily that stood out. She was bright and curious in class, yet reserved outside of it. On this particular afternoon, however, Ms. Carter noticed something unusual. As she dismissed her students, she saw Emily lingering near the classroom door instead of rushing off to the gate like usual. Her tiny shoulders sagged slightly, and her eyes darted around nervously. "Is everything okay, Emily?" Miss Carter asked gently, kneeling down to meet the girl's gaze. Emily hesitated before forcing a small smile. "I'm fine," she said softly, clutching her backpack straps tightly. But Miss Carter wasn't convinced. There was a flicker of unease in Emily's expression that didn't sit right with her. A few minutes later, Mark finally arrived. Unlike his usual punctuality, he was running late today. When he entered the school office to sign Emily out, his face looked tense, and his hands fidgeted awkwardly with the pen. Normally calm and composed, Mark now seemed distracted, almost as if he were in a hurry to leave. Ms. Carter watched from across the room as he exchanged quick pleasantries with the receptionist before heading outside to collect Emily. As Mark approached the gate where Emily waited, Ms. Carter couldn't shake the strange feeling growing in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't anything obvious, just a subtle shift in behavior, a faint crack in the otherwise predictable pattern of their daily routine. Still, something felt off. The more she thought about it, the more her mind drifted back to earlier conversations she'd overheard among the faculty. Rumors swirled about Mark and Emily's family situation. Apparently, Emily's parents had gone through a bitter divorce, and custody battles had left both sides fractured. While Mark legally had full custody, whispers suggested that Emily's mother, Sarah, had tried repeatedly to warn the school about potential risks. At the time, no one paid much attention to those warnings. They sounded too dramatic, too far-fetched. After all, Mark seemed like such a good father. But now, standing there watching him guide Emily toward the car, Miss Carter found herself second-guessing everything she thought she knew. Why did Emily look so anxious? Why was Mark acting differently today? And why couldn't she ignore the nagging voice inside her head, telling her to pay closer attention? She glanced at the clock. Most teachers would have gone back to their classrooms by now, preparing lessons or grading papers. But Miss Carter stayed rooted to the spot, her eyes following Mark and Emily until they disappeared into the parking lot. Something deep within her urged her not to let them go. Not just yet. Months before this unsettling afternoon, Emily's life had been anything but peaceful. Her parents' marriage had crumbled under the weight of constant arguments and unresolved differences. What started as heated disagreements escalated into a full-blown legal battle over custody of their only child. In the end, the courts awarded primary custody to Mark, deeming him the more stable parent based on the evidence presented. However, behind closed doors, things were far from simple. Emily's mother, Sarah, had never stopped fighting for her daughter. A soft-spoken woman with a determined spirit, Sarah believed that Mark was manipulating Emily and turning her against her maternal family. She claimed he isolated Emily from her grandparents, aunts, and cousins, people who had once been an integral part of her life. Though Sarah tried to present these concerns in court, her accusations lacked concrete proof. Without tangible evidence, the judge dismissed her claims, leaving her heartbroken and powerless. Determined not to give up, Sarah reached out to the school multiple times, pleading with the administration to keep a close eye on Emily. Please, she begged during one phone call, her voice trembling with emotion. If you ever notice anything unusual, if Mark tries to take her somewhere unexpected, don't hesitate to contact me or the authorities. But her warnings fell on deaf ears. To the school staff, Mark appeared responsible and trustworthy. His polished demeanor and polite interactions made it easy to dismiss Sarah's fears as paranoia stemming from a painful divorce. Miss Carter vaguely remembered hearing snippets of these conversations months ago. At the time, she hadn't given them much thought. After all, Mark seemed like a model father. He attended every parent-teacher conference, asked thoughtful questions about Emily's progress, and always greeted the staff warmly. How could someone who acted so caring possibly pose a threat? Yet, as Ms. Carter replayed the events of the day in her mind, doubt crept in. The memory of Sarah's desperate pleas came rushing back to her. She recalled how Sarah's voice cracked when she spoke about Emily, how her hand shook as she handed over documents detailing her side of the story. Was it possible that Sarah's warnings weren't just the ramblings of a scorned ex-wife? Could there be truth hidden beneath the surface? The more Ms. Carter thought about it, the harder it became to ignore the pieces that didn't fit together. Why had Mark seemed so rushed today? Why did Emily look so uneasy? And why had Sarah gone to such lengths to ensure her daughter's safety if there wasn't at least some cause for concern? Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of car engines revving in the parking lot. Realizing that Mark and Emily were already heading off campus, Ms. Carter felt a surge of panic. If something was truly wrong, waiting until tomorrow, or even the next hour, might be too late. She glanced toward the school building, where other teachers were busy tidying up classrooms or chatting casually by the lockers. No one else seemed to share her unease. For a moment, Miss Carter hesitated. Should she trust her instincts and follow them? Or should she brush off her concerns as mere overthinking? It was risky to act without clear evidence, but deep down, she knew she couldn't live with herself if she ignored what might be a cry for help. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her keys and hurried toward her car, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. Whatever lay ahead, she told herself, she had to find out, for Emily's sake. Ms. Carter's hands trembled slightly as she turned the key in the ignition. Her car roared to life, and she pulled out of the school parking lot, her eyes scanning the road ahead for any sign of Mark's vehicle. She had no idea where they were going or what she would do if she found them. But one thing was certain. She couldn't let them vanish without knowing why her instincts were screaming so loudly. At first, everything seemed normal. Mark drove in the direction of their neighborhood, just as he always did. Miss Carter kept a safe distance, careful not to draw attention to herself. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of turning onto their usual street, Mark signaled left and took a detour down a quieter road. Miss Carter's stomach tightened. This wasn't part of his regular route. Where was he taking Emily? The further they drove, the more uneasy Miss Carter became. The streets grew narrower, lined with old warehouses and empty lots. Eventually, Mark's car slowed down and turned into the parking lot of a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of town. Miss Carter's heart sank as she watched him park near the corner of the building, away from prying eyes. What was he doing here? And why had he brought Emily to such a place? She parked her car a short distance away, ensuring she stayed out of sight. Her mind raced with questions. Was this some kind of emergency stop? Or was there something darker at play? Whatever it was, it didn't feel right. Determined to get answers, Miss Carter grabbed her phone and dialed the school principal's number. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she pressed call. "Hello," the principal answered, his voice calm and professional. "Sir, it's Miss Carter," she said quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I followed Mark and Emily after dismissal because, well, I had a bad feeling about today. They didn't go home. They're at a motel now, and I think something might be wrong." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When the principal finally spoke, his tone was firm but cautious. "Miss Carter, I understand your concern, but you need to be careful. You can't just follow parents around based on a hunch. It could put you in a difficult position legally." "I know," she replied, her voice tinged with frustration. "But sir, please trust me on this. Something isn't adding up. Please call the authorities if I'm not back in 10 minutes." Before the principal could respond, Ms. Carter ended the call. She knew he meant well, but she couldn't wait any longer. Every second counted, and she needed to act fast. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of her car and approached the motel cautiously, her footsteps soft against the cracked pavement. As she drew closer, she spotted Mark unlocking the door to one of the rooms. He glanced around briefly, his expression tense, before ushering Emily inside. Miss Carter ducked behind a nearby pillar, her pulse racing. She peeked through the gap in the curtains and saw Mark unpacking food onto a small table, while Emily sat silently on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. There was no laughter, no warmth, just an unsettling stillness that made Miss Carter's skin crawl. Her instincts screamed louder than ever. Something was terribly wrong. Summoning every ounce of courage, Miss Carter walked up to the door and knocked firmly, her heart pounding in her chest. When Mark opened it, his face went pale with shock. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. Miss Carter didn't flinch. "I need to speak with Emily," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But as Mark hesitated, glancing nervously between her and a room, she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. Mark's eyes narrowed as he stared at Miss Carter, his jaw tightening with frustration. "What are you doing here?" he repeated, his voice low and sharp, like a warning. He stood in the doorway, blocking her view of the room behind him. His body language was tense, almost defensive, as if he were guarding something or someone. Miss Carter didn't back down. She straightened her posture, meeting his gaze with unwavering determination. "I need to speak with Emily," she said again, her tone calm but firm. "Alone." For a moment, Mark looked like he might refuse. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and his lips pressed together in a thin line. But then, after what felt like an eternity, he stepped aside reluctantly, muttering under his breath about how this was unnecessary and intrusive. Miss Carter ignored his complaints and stepped into the dimly lit motel room, her heart pounding as she took in the scene before her. The space was small and sparsely furnished, a sagging double bed, a rickety table, and 2 chairs that looked like they might collapse under the slightest pressure. A faint smell of mildew hung in the air, making it clear this wasn't a place anyone would choose to stay unless they had no other option. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, clutching her stuffed bunny rabbit tightly against her chest. Her wide eyes darted between Miss Carter and Mark, filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. Kneeling down beside her, Miss Carter gave Emily a warm, reassuring smile. "Hey there," she said softly, keeping her voice gentle so as not to startle the girl. "Can we talk for a minute?" Emily hesitated, glancing nervously at Mark, who lingered near the doorway with his arms crossed. It was obvious she was scared, scared of saying the wrong thing, scared of disappointing her father, scared of whatever consequences might follow if she spoke up. Miss Carter reached out slowly, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "It's okay," she whispered. "You can tell me anything." At first, Emily didn't respond. She hugged her bunny closer, her tiny frame trembling slightly. But as the seconds ticked by, something shifted in her expression. Maybe it was the kindness in Miss Carter's voice, or the way she knelt at eye level, treating Emily like an equal rather than a child to be dismissed. Whatever it was, it gave Emily the courage to nod almost imperceptibly. Taking a deep breath, Miss Carter leaned in closer. "Do you want to go home?" she asked quietly, careful to keep her tone neutral. "To your real home, with your mom." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, and for a split second, she froze, glancing toward Mark as though afraid he might overhear. Then, ever so slightly, she nodded again, her grip on the bunny loosening just a fraction. That tiny movement spoke volumes. It confirmed everything Miss Carter had feared, and more. Standing up, Miss Carter turned to face Mark, who had been watching the exchange with growing unease. "I think we need to have a serious conversation," she said firmly, stepping between him and Emily protectively. Outside, Mark's face flushed red with anger, but he didn't argue. Instead, he muttered something indistinct and stepped out of the room, leaving Miss Carter alone with Emily once again. As soon as the door clicked shut, Emily burst into tears, burying her face in Miss Carter's shoulder. The teacher held her close, whispering soothing words as she pulled out her phone to send a quick text to the school principal. "Call the police. Now." While waiting for help to arrive, Miss Carter kept Emily distracted, asking her about school projects and favorite books. Despite the gravity of the situation, she managed to coax a few hesitant smiles from the little girl. Outside, Mark paced anxiously, occasionally glancing through the window but staying far enough away to avoid suspicion. Miss Carter knew time was running out. If Mark realized what was happening, he might try to flee. But for now, Emily was safe, and that was all that mattered. The sound of distant sirens cut through the tense silence, growing louder with each passing second. Miss Carter glanced out the motel window, her heart racing as she saw flashing blue and red lights pull into the parking lot. Relief washed over her. Help had arrived. She turned back to Emily, who was still sitting on the bed, clutching her stuffed bunny tightly. The little girl's eyes widened at the sight of the police cars, and she looked up at Miss Carter with a mix of fear and hope. "It's okay, sweetheart," Miss Carter reassured her gently, brushing a strand of hair away from Emily's face. "These are good people. They're here to make sure you're safe." Outside, Mark froze when he saw the officers stepping out of their vehicles. His expression shifted rapidly, from confusion to anger, then finally to panic. He started pacing again, muttering under his breath as the authorities approached the room. When one of the officers knocked firmly on the door, Mark hesitated for a moment before opening it, his face pale and strained. "Can I help you?" he asked, trying to sound calm but failing to mask the tremor in his voice. "We received a report about a possible custody issue involving your daughter," the officer replied evenly, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "We need to speak with both of you to understand what's going on." Mark's jaw tightened, and he began to protest. "This is ridiculous. I have full custody of my daughter. You can check the papers if you want. There's nothing wrong here." But even as he spoke, his eyes darted nervously toward the room where Emily sat with Miss Carter. The officer held up a hand to stop him. "Sir, we'll get to that. First, we'd like to speak with Emily privately. Is that all right?" Mark hesitated, clearly torn between refusing and complying. After a tense pause, he stepped aside reluctantly, allowing the officer to enter the room. Miss Carter greeted the officer with a nod, silently signaling her gratitude. She gave Emily's hand a gentle squeeze before stepping outside, leaving the two of them alone. As the door closed behind her, Miss Carter found herself face to face with Mark once again. His frustration boiled over into outright hostility. "You had no right to interfere," he snapped, pointing a finger at her. "Do you have any idea how much trouble this could cause? Do you think this is helping Emily?" Miss Carter stood her ground, meeting his glare with steady resolve. "I'm not doing this to hurt anyone," she said firmly. "I'm doing it because something didn't feel right, and because Emily deserves to be safe. If everything is fine, then there's nothing to worry about. But if it's not..." She let the sentence trail off, her meaning clear. Inside the room, the officer knelt down beside Emily, speaking to her in a soft, reassuring tone. He asked simple questions at first: her name, her age, whether she was feeling okay. Gradually, he moved on to more specific topics, asking about her day, her home life, and how she felt about being at the motel. At first, Emily was hesitant, glancing toward the door as though afraid of Mark overhearing. But the officer's patience paid off. Slowly, she began to open up. Meanwhile, outside, another officer reviewed Mark's custody documents while questioning him further. It didn't take long for inconsistencies to surface. When asked why they were staying at the motel, Mark struggled to provide a convincing explanation. Under pressure, he eventually admitted that he planned to leave town with Emily, using fake IDs and cash to avoid detection. The revelation sent shockwaves through the group gathered in the parking lot. When the officer emerged from the room a short while later, his expression was grim. He motioned for his partner, and together, they informed Mark that he was under arrest for attempted kidnapping and violating the restraining order Sarah had filed against him. As handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Mark protested loudly, insisting that he only wanted to protect Emily. But his words fell on deaf ears. Through the chaos, Miss Carter stayed close to Emily, shielding her from the commotion as best she could. When the little girl caught sight of her mother rushing toward them, tears streaming down her face, Emily broke free and ran into Sarah's arms. The reunion was emotional, years of pain, longing, and uncertainty melting away in an instant. Sarah hugged her daughter tightly, whispering promises that she would never let anything separate them again. For the first time all day, Miss Carter allowed herself to exhale. Her instincts had been right, and because she trusted them, Emily was safe. The parking lot of the motel was a blur of activity as officers guided Mark into the back seat of a police car, his protests fading into the hum of sirens. Emily clung tightly to her mother, Sarah, who rocked her gently, tears streaming down both their faces. For weeks, maybe even months, Sarah had lived in fear that she'd never see her daughter again, fear that her warnings would go unheeded, and fear that she'd lose the battle for custody forever. Now, standing there with Emily safe in her arms, all those fears began to dissolve. Miss Carter watched from a short distance, her heart swelling with relief, but also heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. She knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a long road ahead for Emily and her family. Still, seeing Sarah and Emily reunited gave her a sense of purpose. Whatever criticism or backlash might come her way for intervening, she knew she'd done the right thing. As the officers finished securing the scene, one of them approached Miss Carter. "You handled this situation well," he said, offering a small nod of respect. "Your quick thinking likely prevented something much worse from happening." Miss Carter nodded gratefully but remained modest. "I just followed my instincts," she replied. "And I'm glad I did. Emily deserves to be safe and happy." While the authorities wrapped up their work, Sarah turned to Miss Carter, her eyes still glistening with tears. "Thank you," she choked out, her voice trembling with emotion. "If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened." She hugged Emily closer as if emphasizing how close they'd come to losing each other. Miss Carter smiled softly, placing a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Emily is an amazing girl," she said. "She's strong, and she has people who love her very much. You most of all. Just keep being there for her, and she'll get through this." Sarah nodded, determination replacing the fear in her eyes. "I will. I promise." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues across the sky, Emily finally began to relax. Sitting in the backseat of Sarah's car, she leaned against her mother, her bunny rabbit tucked securely under one arm. Though exhaustion lingered in her tiny frame, there was a flicker of peace in her expression, a quiet reassurance that she was exactly where she belonged. Meanwhile, Miss Carter drove home, replaying the events of the day in her mind. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues, friends, and even strangers who had caught wind of the story. Some praised her bravery. Others questioned whether she had overstepped her role as a teacher. A few accused her of meddling in personal matters, while many more thanked her for stepping in when no one else seemed willing to act. Though the mixed reactions weighed on her, Miss Carter reminded herself why she became a teacher in the first place: to protect and nurture her students, not just academically but emotionally and physically too. If trusting her instincts meant risking controversy, so be it. The lives of children were far more important than public opinion. That night, as she settled into bed, Ms. Carter allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought about Emily, the way her eyes lit up during class discussions, the way she sometimes lingered after school to ask questions about books or share stories about her weekend. And she thought about Sarah, whose desperation and love for her daughter had driven her to fight tirelessly, even when the odds felt insurmountable. For Miss Carter, this experience reinforced something she already knew deep down, that teaching wasn't just about lesson plans and grades. It was about paying attention, truly paying attention, to the subtle cues, the unspoken fears, and the silent pleas for help. Sometimes it meant taking risks. But in the end, those risks could make all the difference in the world. As sleep finally claimed her, Ms. Carter drifted off with a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons to teach, and new opportunities to make a difference. And she was ready. The days following the incident were a whirlwind of emotions for everyone involved. For Emily, life slowly began to return to some semblance of normalcy. But it wasn't easy. The trauma of nearly being taken away lingered like a shadow, creeping into her dreams and coloring her waking moments with anxiety. She often woke up in the middle of the night, clutching her bunny rabbit, and calling out for her mom. Sarah stayed by her side through every restless moment, holding her close and whispering words of comfort until Emily drifted back to sleep. During the day, Emily seemed quieter than usual at school. Her once bright enthusiasm for learning had dimmed slightly, replaced by a cautious reserve. Miss Carter noticed this change immediately and made it a point to check in with her regularly. Whether it was inviting Emily to help organize books in the classroom, or simply asking how her morning had been, Miss Carter ensured that Emily felt seen and supported. Over time, these small gestures helped rebuild Emily's confidence, reminding her that she was surrounded by people who cared about her deeply. Sarah, too, faced her own challenges as she worked to heal the wounds left by the ordeal. Determined to create a stable environment for Emily, she threw herself into rebuilding their lives. She reached out to therapists who specialized in helping children process trauma, ensuring Emily had access to the care she needed. At the same time, Sarah joined support groups for parents navigating custody battles, finding solace in connecting with others who understood her struggles. Through these efforts, she not only helped Emily heal, but also found strength within herself, a resilience she hadn't realized she possessed. Meanwhile, news of the incident spread throughout the community, sparking conversations about child safety and parental rights. Parents began discussing the importance of open communication between schools and families, while educators debated the role teachers should play in safeguarding students beyond the classroom. Though opinions varied widely, one thing was clear. The story of Miss Carter's intervention resonated deeply with many, prompting calls for better safeguards in situations involving custody disputes. At the school, administrators took immediate action to address the gaps exposed by the event. They implemented stricter protocols for student pickups, requiring additional verification whenever there were changes to routine procedures. Parents were asked to provide updated emergency contacts and consent forms, and staff members received training on recognizing signs of potential issues in family dynamics. While some teachers grumbled about the added paperwork, most agreed that the new measures were necessary to ensure every child's safety. For Miss Carter, the aftermath brought both praise and criticism. Some hailed her as a hero, crediting her quick thinking with saving Emily from a potentially devastating fate. Others questioned whether she had overstepped professional boundaries by following Mark and involving law enforcement without concrete evidence. Despite the mixed reactions, Ms. Carter remained steadfast in her belief that she'd done the right thing. "If I hadn't acted," she later told a colleague, "I would have spent the rest of my life wondering what might have happened." As weeks turned into months, Emily began to thrive once again. With therapy, love, and unwavering support from her mother and teacher, she rediscovered her joy for learning and her playful spirit. She started participating more actively in class, raising her hand to answer questions and sharing stories during show and tell. Her laughter returned, a sound so precious it brought tears to Sarah's eyes, and her bond with Miss Carter grew stronger than ever. One afternoon, as dismissal time approached, Emily walked up to Miss Carter's desk and handed her a folded piece of paper. "This is for you," she said shyly, her cheeks flushing pink. Inside was a simple drawing, a stick figure teacher standing beside a smiling girl holding hands under a bright yellow sun. At the bottom, written in careful block letters, were the words, "Thank you for saving me." Miss Carter blinked back tears as she hugged Emily tightly. In that moment, she knew all the risks, doubts, and challenges had been worth it. For Emily, and for every child like her, there could be no greater reward than knowing they were safe, loved, and valued. The incident became a turning point not just for Emily and her family, but for the entire community. Conversations about child safety that had once been brushed aside now took center stage. Parents began attending workshops hosted by local schools to learn how to identify signs of distress in their children. Teachers participated in training sessions on recognizing red flags in parental behavior and understanding when to escalate concerns. The school district even formed a task force dedicated to reviewing policies surrounding custody disputes and student welfare. For Miss Carter, the experience reinforced something she had always believed. Being a teacher wasn't just about academics, it was about protecting her students in every way possible. She carried this lesson into her daily interactions, paying closer attention to the subtle cues her students gave off. Was a child unusually quiet? Did they seem anxious during dismissal time? Were there changes in their behavior or appearance that warranted further investigation? These questions became part of her routine, reminders that trust and vigilance went hand in hand. Emily's story also inspired broader change beyond the school walls. Sarah worked tirelessly to raise awareness about parental alienation and the need for better safeguards in custody cases. She spoke at community events, sharing her journey with raw honesty and urging others not to stay silent if they suspected something was wrong. Her advocacy caught the attention of local lawmakers, who began exploring legislation aimed at improving communication between courts, schools, and families in high-conflict custody situations. As months passed, Emily continued to grow stronger. Therapy helped her process the trauma of that day at the motel, giving her tools to manage her fears and anxieties. With her mother's unwavering support, she learned to express her feelings openly instead of bottling them up. At school, she blossomed under Miss Carter's encouragement, rediscovering her love for storytelling and art. One day, she proudly presented a picture book she created, complete in colorful illustrations and handwritten captions, to Miss Carter. "This is my happy ending," Emily said with a grin, pointing to a page where a little girl stood hand in hand with her mom beneath a shining sun. But perhaps the most profound impact of all was the bond between Emily and Miss Carter. What started as a typical teacher-student relationship had transformed into something deeper, a connection built on trust, courage, and mutual respect. Emily looked up to Miss Carter as more than just a teacher. She saw her as someone who had fought for her when no one else could. And Miss Carter, in turn, found inspiration in Emily's resilience and strength. One afternoon, during a quiet moment after class, Emily approached Miss Carter with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think bad things happen so we can learn good stuff?" she asked, tilting her head curiously. Miss Carter paused, considering the question. Then she smiled warmly. "Sometimes, yes," she replied. "Bad things can feel really scary, but they can also teach us how to be brave, kind, and strong. And sometimes they remind us how important it is to look out for each other." Emily nodded thoughtfully, as though processing the idea. After a moment, she hugged Miss Carter tightly around the waist. "I'm glad you're my teacher," she whispered. "And I'm glad you're my student," Miss Carter replied, hugging her back just as fiercely. In the end, the story served as a powerful reminder of the importance of listening, not just to words, but to instincts, emotions, and unspoken signals. It showed that even in moments of doubt or fear, taking action could lead to outcomes far greater than imagined. For Emily, Sarah, and Miss Carter, the road ahead wasn't without its challenges, but it was paved with hope, healing, and an unshakable belief in the power of doing what's right, even when it's hard.